Welcome to the General and the Journalist podcast, our first episode of our new podcast from the Times and the Sunday Times.
And the general bit of the equation is you, Patrick. General Sir Patrick Sanders, head of the British Army or Chief of the General Staff until last year and now retired.
And you're the journalist, Tom. Tom Newton Dunn, a former defence correspondent and political editor, and now a broadcaster and writer at the Times.
So we'll be here every week, so please do follow us wherever you get your podcasts. We're going to try to explain an ever more dangerous world and how possibly it could be made a little less dangerous.
So we want to unpack what's behind it all and suggest where it may lead, so to inform and hopefully also to reassure.
Now, usually, Patrick, it would just be you and me, and we'll tackle one subject head on, like the chances of peace deals in Ukraine or Iran, or an ongoing hot war. In fact, one of more than 100 hot wars that are currently raging all over the globe.
Yeah, we'll try and dig into the detail, why wars start, how they're fought on the ground, in the air, on the seas, in cyberspace, and indeed possibly in space, and most importantly, how they can be brought to a conclusion.
But when it's right, we'll be joined by a special guest, hopefully quite regularly. And to mark our very first episode, we have a very special guest.
And with us today, in something of an exclusive, is Sir Simon Case. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming in.
Congratulations on launching your podcast.
Very kind.
Thanks. Yes, this is a first for me as well as for you. So until the end of last year, Simon, you were the Cabinet Secretary, the UK's most senior civil servant and the most senior policy advisor to the Prime Minister. And this, I think, is the first time you've spoken public to anyone since stepping down from the role. So good to have you on the show, Simon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As I said, it's a real pleasure to be speaking particularly on this topic, something that has been a big feature of my career, defence and national security.
Yeah, well, exactly as you say. So we wanted to invite you on because as the former Cabinet Secretary, you've got a unique perspective on national security and how governments make the big decisions relating to national security.
So, prepping this episode, I wrote quite a long bio of you. I was going to read out. It would have taken me about 10 minutes. So extensive is your quite extraordinary career over the last 15, 20 years. In short, though, and I have been able to sub it down, it's a cast iron fact that no civil servant or politician has had more experience at the highest level of government over the last 15 years than you, Simon. You worked very closely with 6 different prime ministers, first as Principal Private Secretary to David Cameron and Theresa May, and then as Cabinet Secretary, Head of the Civil Service, Sir Humphrey himself, no less, to Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, and finally, Sir Keir Starmer. In fact, you were the youngest Cabinet Secretary in 100 years when you were first appointed in 2020, and your 5 years in the job saw some of the most turbulent times in modern British history, including the COVID pandemic and Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. But before all that, slightly lesser known fact about you, you started off as a civil service in the Ministry of Defence, and you've retained a very strong interest and involvement in defence and security throughout your career. And that, we think, is why you've agreed to talk to us today.
Absolutely right. I think my interest in defence goes back actually to the age of 17, where as soon as I was old enough, I signed up to become a reservist while still at school. I signed up for the Royal Marines Reserve and then later transferred to become an Army reservist, then became a civil servant after doing a PhD on nuclear matters in the Cold War under the brilliant Peter Hennessy. Yeah. Joined the Ministry of Defence as my first job, actually working on nuclear matters. And then, like many other people during that era, found myself working on counterterrorism, on those non-state threats that dominated that period of thinking. And then, latterly, perhaps more in Number 10 and then as Cabinet Secretary, my career came back to defence, but this time very focused on the state threats, many of which I think we'll no doubt talk about.
So I love it how you drop in, at the end of really interesting career in defence and security and nuclear. I did this job as Cabinet Secretary, almost to throw it away.
Yes. Well, I suppose, there are many things I suppose people don't really understand what the job of Cabinet Secretary is. But actually, certainly in my time and my predecessors, Mark Sedwell, another Cabinet Secretary who'd had a largely national security background, say huge amounts of my time at Cabinet Secretary was focused on national security, foreign policy, defence matters.
First duty of government.
Absolutely. It's really interesting. I saw something that Keir Starmer said last week in, I think it was at the London Defence Conference, in the middle of his speech, he called national security the central organising principle of government. And I'm sort of reflecting on that, thinking actually it's a pretty good description, and therefore I think many people would be surprised to hear that the Cabinet Secretary spends so much of their time on national security. But I mean, there are some bits and pieces. I was every week at the National Security Council meetings that obviously been involved in all the international calls and issues that the Prime Minister was doing. You oversee the intelligence agencies as Cabinet Secretary, which I'd been part of earlier in my career.
And I guess why? It's because so much of that world is unseen. A lot of that, by necessity, is, after all, secret and very highly classified. So you can't do much talking about it.
I think it's absolutely right. And also there are areas where Prime Ministers tend to have quite a unique role. I mean, not just as chair of something like the National Security Council, but things like the intelligence agencies, sensitive operations, and obviously the big features, relationships with the United States, whether matters of war and peace, the sorts of thing you'll be talking about over the weeks to come. Those are all on the Prime Minister's desks day in, day out. The Prime Minister, you think of their week. Yes, they've got cabinet to chair and they've got a Prime Minister's questions and they've probably got to be out on the road somewhere during the week. But actually, I think people would be surprised about how much of the Prime Minister's time is spent on the very topics that you'll be talking about.
Well, let's step back a bit, because we want to talk about how you see this breakdown of the global order. We've got the soon-to-be-published Strategic Defence Review. We'd like to talk about that. Our general preparedness for war, the nuclear deterrent, which obviously you've got a very keen interest in and have had a decisive role in. Then President Trump, NATO, Russia, Putin, and how the UK's decision-making process works during times of crisis, and more if time allows. So let's talk about the current world order, or rather the lack of it. As we've been talking about, you've had a remarkable front row seat for the last decade. How do you think about this flux that we're experiencing in the world order?
I'm sorry to say I'm something of a pessimist on these questions. As I said earlier on in my career, life, business, the job was dominated by non-state threats, and we adapted our national security apparatus to focus on counterterrorism, either at home and overseas. And now, perhaps more clearly than ever, we have got this emergence of the strong man version of politics and international relations. This has been there throughout. It's just that actually we've had our primary focus on non-state threats. Yeah. The emergence of China as a pace-setting threat with quasi-imperial ambitions, Putin and his malign intentions have been there. He's just most recently expressed them afresh in Ukraine. Yeah. We've known for a long time about the deeply disruptive and destructive influence of Iran across the Middle East. This is the way of things, and is going to be, I would think, as I look out on my children's lives, the next 10, probably 20 years is going to be dominated by this interstate conflict, where collaboration and cooperation is perhaps the things that we've relied on actually since the beginnings of the Cold War are less certain. Yeah. We're going to have to work harder at these coalitions and these alliances in the face of dictators and autocrats.
I mean, you've listed 4 of the principal actors. In fact, you didn't list North Korea, but you could have equally listed that as well. And you've referred to terrorism. And when you think about each of those different threats and almost the aggregation of them, because they're acting, as you say, in concert, which is the most acute? And then does that remain the most pressing threat, or do others emerge?
It's very tempting to get very temporal in these moments. We are currently supporting the Ukrainians in conflict with the Russians. We're working very hard across the UK and everywhere else to bring peace to the Middle East, where, many of the actors are and have been supported by Iran for years. So those feel like the immediate threats. But as you say, there is an intermingling of these issues. Only a month or two ago, it became clear publicly something that I think others had known for quite a long time, that North Korean troops were serving on the front line for the Russians in their illegal and immoral fight with the Ukrainians. The long-term issue for me, though, is China as the pace-setting threat. It is the nation with enormous economic powers, scientific, technological, industrial powers. We see it spreading its intentions and influence and its tentacles around the world, the Belt and Road Initiative, ports now in Sri Lanka and Djibouti. They're making huge leaps forwards in military technology and clearly have the intention to use it. And what you see is amongst those nations that we've mentioned, like China, North Korea, Iran, Russia, the sharing of technology that's going on there with China being that pace-setting technology threat. So for me, that is the biggest question of all over the next 20 years is all going to be about China, whether directly or indirectly, how it's influencing others. But of course, there are more immediate threats that we have to deal with.
So you very graphically said what's happening, and it's a fairly scary prospect, the rise of a brand new superpower. But why is that a threat? Pin down precisely what is threatening about it.
And if I come in on the same sort of theme, it strikes me that China actually likes order. It likes rules. It hates chaos. And so it's trying to remake, they still want a world order, just on their own terms, whereas Russia looks very much more disruptive, let the world burn.
Yeah. Well, I think, you said it, the Chinese like order. It's just got to be their own order. And I think, why...
But why does that threaten us?
Why worry about China? Well, actually, for me, it does start at the heart of it about values. It is not a democracy operating in the same way as we do or many other nations, including those that have had imperial ambitions. China is about sustaining the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. That is really what is at the heart of Chinese intentions. It doesn't have a place for democracy. It doesn't have a place for all of the values that we hold dear, like freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And of course, the way that the Chinese have been operating is, there are indicators of deeply worrying signs. Go back to the Sri Lankan port, originally part of the Belt and Road Initiative, where the Chinese are lending out huge amounts of money for infrastructure, including across Africa, and demanding in return, all sorts of preferential
debt trap diplomacy.
Debt trap diplomacy. The Sri Lankan port's a really good example. Sri Lankans can't afford their debt repayments. The Chinese say, great, well, we'll just take hold of the port then for 100 years. Thank you very much. That's how you do it. And many people would say, but hold on, isn't that how we behaved over many centuries? And you say, well,
Chinese say that, for example.
Yes, to which we would say, yes, in some ways, but we are now a modern democracy. When we don't like what our government is doing, you can go to the ballot box and throw that lot out and put someone else in. This is a really fundamentally important way of doing it. And I think the way that certainly the UK and probably most G7 countries operate now is, yes, of course, we have our own strong sense of what our national interests are, but we do also have a sense of wanting open, free-flowing global interaction that's in the interests, a tide that rises, it sort of lifts all boats on it, I think. And I'm not sure that is really the intention that's at the heart of China, that's there to fundamentally support the Chinese Communist Party.
We've got this window of opportunity, window of time, this of peril with China and, of course, Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits, where the PLA had been told to be ready by 2027 and estimates range. And there's so much potential for miscalculation. Do you think there is a threat window that we're looking at, or is that overplayed?
There is a window, and sadly it probably starts earlier than we'd like, and it's open for longer than we'd like as well. I think you're absolutely right to call out Xi's instructions to the PLA about being ready. We have an appalling history of reading what dictators say or write in public and failing to act.
That happened in 2022.
I was to say exactly this, and sort of great credit to a few people inside the Ministry of Defence, including then Secretary of State Ben Wallace, who was one of the few people actually reading Putin's speeches before and saying, look, this is what's coming. You didn't need secret intelligence to tell you what was coming. You just, turns out dictators often tell you in advance and off you go. And of course, one of the other parts about that preparedness that Xi made clear was also making clear that China had to be ready to withstand the sorts of sanctions that the West put on Russia. This is strategic thinking about how to prepare and insulate China for action. Russia and the window. Now, one of the things that we've seen that autocracies can do, especially in the shape of Russia, that we have been less able to do as the nation supporting Ukraine, is divert your industry back to supporting a war machine. Yeah. Converting factories back almost like they were in the Soviet era again to producing main battle tanks. So this is a nation that is preparing to sustain conflict in Ukraine. And clearly, we've seen only in recent days moving more troops up to the Finnish border, moving more troops in other places in Northern Europe, clearly with the intent to intimidate. Yeah. It feels to me that we, across the Western Alliance, across the NATO alliance, need to get our skates on and be ready, certainly by 2030.
So an unfair question. I mean, you were alongside 6 different prime ministers, and the SDR that was published in 2019.
Yeah, under Johnson.
Didn't, and then we had the refresh of that a couple of years later. Didn't really address that. Is that something that we should have seen coming, or were you a lone voice in the wilderness?
Oh no, I'm certainly not going to lay claim to sort of strategic foresight and insight. I think this probably brings you back. It's more to do with the question of how government works than actually how the outside world is working. Yeah. I think I was trying to work out how many strategic defence reviews or national security reviews or integrated reviews, they've all been called various things over the years. I mean, there must be 6, 7, 8 in my career that I've been involved in. And I think although we often put the word strategy in the title, actually when you read them, you have a combination of some very big long-term threats and trends. So actually, I think in the Johnson era, it was clear talking about China as a pace-setting threat, but no specific foresight of Russia's intention in Ukraine. I mean, even though back to 2014 and Crimea, Russia's intention, Putin's intentions in Ukraine had been clear.
We'll get to Britain. We'll get to
the micro,
or one element of the micro in a moment. But to keep you on the macro, and quite frankly, it's a question for both of you. As the journalist around the table, I'm allowed to ask these things. I throw tomatoes. You guys certainly both used to catch them anyway. To your point, and yours, Patrick, these things were being done in the open. Putin was writing books and speeches and lectures about how Ukraine was going to be part of Greater Russia. China were publicly rearming. Xi was making his intentions incredibly clear, not just for a couple of years, for the last 20 years. You were Cabinet Secretary. You were Chief of the General Staff. Why did the Western world in general not do a better job at spotting these very clear trends?
Simon, you can go first, Patrick. You get to have a think about it.
Thanks very much. Let the guest speak off the top of his head. Fine, that's co-host privilege, I suppose. I would say one of the things, I mean, just by way of context, is actually we've been incredibly bad historically at predicting these pivot points. So, gosh, it's one of the few times in public I think I'll ever have to refer back to my own PhD. It's genuinely a recherche document, I can tell you. Not one even your mother wants to read. But, one of the things I was looking at, this was about the transition from the end of the Second World War to the transition into the Cold War. I found it really striking looking through the personal papers of many extraordinary statesmen, and they nearly all were men at the time, who really struggled there was lots of intelligence information and lots of experts talking to them, about the enormous threat that Soviet Russia played. But it was really interesting. Having had many of them had served in the First World War in uniform and then served in the Second World War as ministers. And a bunch of people like me or Patrick, our predecessors, coming along and saying, congratulations, the good news for you is you've now got to prepare for another war, was really difficult for politicians to take on, especially given everything else that they were trying to do. You know, the Attlee government trying to rebuild the nation from war. We didn't predict the end of the Cold War either. You know, we are very poor. You know, arguably the signs about the real threat from Al-Qaeda and that becoming the dominant sort of international counterterrorism threat. There were some deep experts in government who'd been watching AQ, as we called them, for years. That wasn't heard until, you know, heard loud enough until 9/11. So I think there is something structural about how our expertise actually gets out of often it's quite secret silos, and you transmit that into politicians, and you can fit it into the framework that politicians have for decision making, because you've got really difficult choices to make. People like me, Patrick, can come along and say, look, Prime Minister, we need more tanks, we need more ships, we need more planes, or we need more drones or AI. And the Prime Minister, or perhaps more likely the Chancellor, turns around and says, thanks very much, how exactly are we going to pay for that?
I mean, you make a fair point that it's about priorities. And if you're fighting a war on terrorism, you're in Afghanistan and Iraq at the same time as you were, Patrick, I guess the Prime Minister said, well, I've got to win this war first, we'll worry about Russia and China later. Do you think that's what happened, Patrick?
Well, so I did speak out and got into trouble for doing it.
I was going to say that, but I was trying to be too nice to my
CGS got into quite a lot of trouble quite a lot of the time. But I'm not going to hide behind that, because I spoke out when I took over as head of the army in 2022, when it was dead obvious that we had to respond. And my gripe was that we still are acting much too slowly against the threats that are coming our way. But I'm one of the guilty men as well. And the only explanation I can offer is, first of all, as you say, the government just had other priorities. You know, when that, under David Cameron, it was all about austerity. You know, we were in a financial crisis and everybody had to chip into helping the nation dig itself out of a hole, and defence played its part in that. And then secondly, even though we saw what was happening in Crimea and other parts of, and Georgia, we didn't see it as a threat to NATO. And we had the comfort blanket of knowing that Europe was a much more powerful economy, NATO in being was the most successful alliance in history, and we had the US. And what's changed is we can no longer assume that we have the US. And we'll come on to talk about that later on.
I think the thing that really underlies what Patrick's just said is perhaps a dangerous sense of complacency, as you say, underpinned by US backing for NATO, but perhaps also a sense of comfort taken from, to sort of argue against myself, our own sense of democratic values, our open economy. Surely everybody thinks like we do. Yeah. Why would you possibly want to invade your neighbour and cause chaos in sort of the global economy?
The Chinese don't want to collapse global trade because then they're in a world of their own pain with their own population, for example.
So they would like trade on their own terms. That's what this is about. I'm pretty sure in 30, 40 years' time, people will be writing PhDs about the rise of the Chinese empire, the modern Chinese empire.
Okay, my final question to you on this is, what do you say to those who say, we've had scaremongering like this for decades. It's defence officials, security sorts, it's generals' job to get everyone upset about these sort of things so we can spend more money on defence. And they'll say to you, this isn't really going to happen. The world will be okay, because it always is.
Well, I would just point back to, just what has happened in the last few years. So, there are direct effects. There are many people still in the UK hosting Ukrainian families who fled from conflict. British taxpayers are still picking up the tab for the economic energy bailouts that we had to, put in place. Taxpayers in this country were paying for themselves to be given very large energy discounts in their bills. I'm afraid what happens over there does have impact over here. I remember this being a very clear sign. I remember Tony Blair saying it very clearly, and actually one of the things I worked on in 2007 when Gordon Brown became Prime Minister was his first national security strategy. And the whole point at the heart of that was there is no over there and over here anymore. In the world that we've got, driven by the technology, the economic interactions, the free flow of people, I don't think you can be complacent anymore. You're absolutely right that we're not politicians, though. I mean, we have to be sort of humble in the face of democracy. These are the people who actually are accountable for these choices. It's easy for us to say doom and gloom all the time.
All right. Well, that's a good segue, if you like, from the macro to the micro, from the world to Britain, and talk about the UK specifically now. And Simon, you've just pointed it out yourself, but you've been closely involved in 7 or 8 different security views, depending on how you call them, their different names. The first was with Gordon Brown, way back in 2007. The last one for Sir Keir Starmer, the SDR, the Strategic Defence Review, which we expect the Prime Minister to publish imminently. Simple question to begin with, I guess. Is the UK's defence and security setup currently fit for purpose?
I mean, as ever, when you're trying to describe an enormous system, there are some bits that are in better shape than others. In general, for what we face, probably not. In the round is probably the right assessment. But I think certainly under actually this government, and I would say late under the Conservatives in power, things that needed to be tackled have been tackled. Start with the basics, the money. Rishi Sunak, as a reluctant former chancellor, I think came to the question of defence spending, actually did announce an increase to 2.5% GDP spending. This government has actually brought the deadline for that forward. And I think probably even more significantly than the 2.5 announcement, which is, I know, one that sort of obsessed the British political commentary. Actually, I thought the much more interesting thing that Keir Starmer said in that speech in the House was the 3% during the next Parliament and the announcement of a national security strategy, another strategy. The 3%, I think, tells you that this government, probably a bit like Rishi Sunak, as a lot of last Conservative primes, really understood that trajectory that we've been talking about, that we do have to invest. But money is only part of it. Quite reasonably, many chancellors over the years that I've heard speak about defence would say, why is it that I have to spend about, now £50 billion a year and at least on defence? And every time I want them to do something, there's then another bill that comes on top. Why is it that every programme or most programmes are late, they're over budget? Why can't the MOD manage its finances? Why is defence industry not quick enough to resolve? Why we have this argument all of the time, and Patrick, you've been at the heart of this about what's the right size for our army, and then you actually look at the numbers and you realise whatever our size of our army recently into the 70s or 80,000s or how many frigates you want for the Navy. Turns out we actually can't fill all the slots anyway because we're not recruiting everybody. So there are lots of issues bundled up in this that need tackling. Finances, putting those on a sustainable upward trajectory, getting the most for your money, actually doing something about procurement. You will have written about it for years.
Great source of defence correspondence stories, bungled procurement.
Yeah.
Let's tackle the funding head on, since you brought it up, 2.5%. And by that, we mean increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, or actually gross national income. Yeah. Sir Keir Starmer did bring it forward to 2027. Flat question, straight answer, please, Sir Simon. Is 2.5% in 2027 enough?
Probably not, but I'm not sure you could particularly go further faster anyway.
Can we just unpack the probably not bit and what is enough?
Well, I think the 3% that the government's talking about for the next Parliament is the right sort of ambition, of course.
And just for the listeners, the next Parliament would put us into when? Well,
probably finish 2034, 2035 is what we're looking at. I mean, 3% I think is more likely the space where you probably can be funding everything that you need for the world that's coming. But the issue isn't really about 2.5 in 27. I mean, the real answer to your question is underinvestment for the last couple of decades. I mean, and this is the sort of thing that people like me always say, and you say it in front of select committees and ends up with people throwing things at you. It's very difficult in this world to suddenly turn on the taps in spending. I mean, it takes, at least 12 months to recruit and train somebody coming in at the most basic levels.
We're doing it faster now. But your parallel with manpower, with workforce is exactly the same. If you cut, there's a long tail to that cut. And if you want to regrow again, it takes a long time to do it.
A big argument made by Patrick and the likes of Patrick continues to make it, is that actually moving up to 2.5% of GDP on defence spending basically just fills the current holes, to your point.
Well, not even that.
Or not even that, to those vast decades of underspending. So you're right. No Prime Minister would want to start from here. It's a horrific inheritance of decades of underspending on defence. But if 2.5% isn't enough, it barely fills the holes, or as Patrick said, doesn't even fill the holes. What is now? 3%, 3.5%? Poland spending 5%, Russia spending 7% of its GDP on defence.
I mean, probably if we were spending 3% right now, we'd feel different. We'd feel more positive, but only if we were spending it well. And we should just point out that these things like 2.5% of GDP or 3% or sort of GNR, however you want to measure it, measuring anything through these sorts of inputs is a really daft way of measuring anything.
It's very blunt.
It's a really daft thing. What you should actually be talking about, any business, any sort of CEO running a successful business is really going to be focused on their outcomes and their outputs against their investment. And yet our national debate is, it's the same we have in the NHS, of course, where it's, just another billion into the NHS. And I think the public's does the public know what the difference really is between 2.5% and 3% of GDP? It happens to be tens of billions of pounds if you really know your stuff. But I don't think these sort of numbers and metrics mean anything. It is about, how do professionals actually, like Patrick, when they sit in front of a Prime Minister, as you sort of often do when they come in, or the Prime Minister will say, well, where are we? How do we feel? Give me your briefing on where we are.
I remember it well, with Dom Cummings lurking in the background, wearing trainers and a t-shirt.
Actually, you've got. It's these things that the professionals can tell you. Do I have the people that I need? Am I able to buy the equipment that I need at the pace that I need it? Am I understanding what's happening in all of these battlefields all around the world and what that's going to mean for when we next have to fight?
So I want to take you to the nuclear deterrent, Simon. And, you were one of the authors of Tony Blair's white paper on the renewal of the nuclear deterrent, which was published back in December 2006. And before we get into some of the issues around the nature of deterrence, just describe for us, if you can, what the nuclear deterrent is, how we deliver it from the UK, because we do it differently to other countries, and what scale it's at. And then we'll get into some of the issues.
Yeah. For many generations, we've called the nuclear deterrent the cornerstone of our national security, the ultimate guarantor of our national security. Program that goes back many decades, but now takes the form of 4 nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed submarines, which are based here, always at the moment one on patrol at any one time. Our Vanguard-class submarines, which patrol almost at walking pace somewhere unknown underneath the North Atlantic, there to provide what the gurus call the assured second strike capability. So what does that actually mean? It means that should somebody threaten us with their nuclear weapons, launch a strike on us, we've always got the ability to return fire via nuclear means. Now, of course, the real purpose of those submarines out there, as you know very well, is deterrence. The reason they sit there, the reason that they're on patrol, the reason we have a nuclear deterrent and we call it a deterrent is to make sure that no adversary can ever threaten us with the most extreme harm. such that it would limit our freedom of action.
And worth dwelling just a little bit on the people that do this service for us. I mean, they're all Royal Navy. They're extraordinary people. I've been on board those submarines when one of those patrols comes back. The Day Zero, I'm sure you have as well.
Yeah.
It's a very memorable experience. And they spend months of their lives and months at a time, or years of their lives and months at a time at sea. And some of the longest patrols ever have been conducted recently. So they are an extraordinary breed.
Day zero?
It's the last day of the patrol when they come back in. And so you fly out and go on board the casing, and then you spend a day on board and they tell you about what the patrol has done.
Just to give some additional sort of human colour to this, is for these patrols that are now many, many months long, very limited access to information from the outside world. So one of the most awful duties that falls to the commanding officer of that submarine when it comes back up, next one's gone out to patrol, it can safely come to the surface, receive a whole lot of information. One of the first things that the commanding officer will have to do is tell members of the crew about births, marriages and deaths whilst they've been away.
And to be clear, the reason why it's not receiving information on patrol under the Arctic or the North Atlantic is because
their job is
identifying
Their job
where
is
they
to
are.
vanish.
Yeah.
Their job is to be a black hole in the middle of nowhere. You can spot them because they've got dolphins on their chest. That's the submarine services sign.
They're often quite pale.
Often pale, yes. So we talked about four nuclear submarines, around about 225 or so nuclear warheads, although the exact numbers are secret.
Yeah, declared.
So we have a continuous at-sea deterrence. Other countries deliver nuclear weapons through missiles. They have land systems and they have air systems. Is a so-called triad or a dyad, we've only got the single, is it the right way to deliver our nuclear capability, and do we have enough of it?
So again, ideally, in my view, you wouldn't rely on a single system for anything. That's true in many walks of life, let alone nuclear deterrence. We are the only nuclear power that is operating a single system. The French, who have a nuclear capability that's sort of similar sort of scale to ours, they have nuclear submarines similar to ours, but they also have air-launched or air-dropped nuclear weapons, which they can put on their jet fighters. And we used to have that up until the late 1990s. Actually, in 1997, we took our last air-dropped nuclear weapon out of service.
Well, we had nuclear artillery when I joined.
It's extraordinary. I mean, when you go back through some of the Cold War story, it was almost like we were trying to put nuclear weapons on the tips of pens, if you could. You know, we were trying to put nuclear weapons on. I'm not sure I would go that far, but I think resilience matters. One of the areas that has been underinvested clearly for the last 20 years is our nuclear deterrent. There's an enormous recapitalisation programme going on. Recapitalisation, is
which eats a good chunk of that defence budget we were talking about earlier on.
Mandarin speak for putting more money in, because we are building a new set of submarines up at Barrow. We are trying to recruit new crew. We are having to rebuild all sorts of infrastructure around the country that supports our nuclear deterrent at Aldermaston, which is where we make our weapons, at Devonport, which is where we service our submarines, at Barrow, where we build them, and up at the Clyde, where they sail from. Because defence, despite using the language of the nuclear deterrent being the cornerstone of our national security, actually it has clearly been underinvested in. But you're absolutely right. Investing properly in nuclear means some very tough choices for the rest of defence.
And that second delivery method, would you like to see a second delivery method, ideally, in the SDR?
Yeah, I mean, if you could afford it, yeah.
But the paradox in this is the cost of refreshing the nuclear enterprise will eat an enormous amount of the money available to defence, and that will come at the cost of conventional capability. So you could end up in this position where you have strategic nuclear weapons, but you have quite limited conventional forces. You step from firing a Tomahawk land attack missile or a Meteor or a Storm Shadow, and then the next available weapon you have is a strategic nuclear weapon. So the cost of it is significant. Do you think that we should be, I guess, A, thinking about tactical nuclear weapons to fill that gap, or B, have we got the balance between our conventional capabilities and our nuclear capabilities right?
I would say, I mean, on the latter, no. has sort of put it in military jargon, there are clearly things missing in our ladder of escalation.
And we should explain what we mean by tactical nuclear weapons. So these are shorter range, sub-10 kiloton, still nuclear weapons, but just not as big as the strategic ones.
Yeah, we definitely don't have enough steps nationally between infantry platoon with rifle and strategic nuclear weapons. I think there are a couple of issues though. One is the UK has always had a sort of NATO first doctrine, so you're not having to do all of that ladder of escalation domestically. You can be looking across the NATO alliance to fill some of that, but personally I would like to see more. And of course we are doing some of that, investing in the non-nuclear but high-end capabilities like hypersonics and things like this. These are really important. On tactical nuclear weapons, I actually fall into that group of people who slightly balks at even the language of tactical nuclear weapons, because I think any use of nuclear weapons
is a strategic act.
It will have strategic implications globally. So it's sort of interesting, that.
I'm not sure Putin does.
Well, I mean, actually published Russian doctrine has tactical nuclear weapons in its doctrine for use of how to, its war fighting.
Our nuclear deterrent is not truly independent in the sense that we have a nuclear sharing arrangement with the US. We get the technology from them. We can operate it independently, but we can't build it independently. Do you worry that with some of the doubts that are now must exist about the US's extended deterrence concept, so the idea that it would exchange Los Angeles for London, means that we ought to move towards having a truly independent nuclear deterrent like the French do?
Should we just explain that currently our nuclear deterrent, our only nuclear deterrent, is Trident, which is made by Lockheed Martin, which is an American company. We don't even own those Trident missiles. We lease them from Lockheed Martin.
Yeah, and in what's called a mingled stockpile. So I think the thing that's critical, that's the decision that many governments have taken going back over decades, is the operational independence. Once those missiles are in the boat, they've got our warheads on them, and it's at sea. And the only person that can give the instruction to use those weapons is a British Prime Minister or somebody else if that Prime Minister is no longer around. So, they are operationally independent. I think that's the thing that crucially matters. That's the thing that allows you that ultimate guarantor. For me, is it a problem that we don't make our own missiles? At the heart of this decision is the balance that we've been talking about. You have a limited amount of money to spend on defence. Where do you spend your money? If we had our own missiles, we would be spending even more of our defence budget on the nuclear capability. So for me, the Americans over many, many decades have been incredibly reliable nuclear partners and still are.
Really?
And
because that is absolutely pivotal, though, isn't it?
Yes, they
are.
are
They still under President Trump?
Yes.
Vice President, possibly soon President J.D. Vance, with the very isolationist views.
Yeah.
Are they still a 100% reliable nuclear partner? Because that's what this whole debate depends on.
For me, yes. Everything I've seen and heard makes me think yes.
You share that surety, Patrick?
I think we have to. I do, yeah. Because doing
is different.
I do incline to optimism here, because we've seen so many disruptions in the relationship between the UK and the US since this started, not least Suez, and the roots between the defence and security establishments on both sides of the Atlantic are so deep and so entwined that it would take more than one presidential administration to disrupt that.
Before we finish on nuclear, just one quick point. You've literally written the thesis, the doctrine, the reviews, Tony Blair's review.
One of the world's dullest men.
Or one of Britain's premier experts on our nuclear deterrent. You're also one of the probably very few men, maybe I'm around the table with two different men, who knows exactly how many nuclear warheads we currently have. It's highly classified. It's been reported as around 225. In the 1970s, at the height, we had 520 nuclear warheads, or at least that was reported, roughly double. Without saying how many or how many more you think we should have, should we increase the current number of nuclear warheads that we currently hold?
I think this is one of those things where my very strong view is that we should return to an era when we maintain a higher degree of ambiguity about our
nuclear capabilities. Translate that from idiot hack.
No. That is the answer to that one.
Nice try, Tom.
Deterrence depends on your adversary having some doubts in their mind, or rather them being certain that you can do real harm to them in the sort of ultimate case. And, you know, for me, things like warhead numbers and all this sort of thing, we, over the last few years, have been moving towards more ambiguity about our capabilities. And for me, that is the right direction of travel. Okay. And no, sorry, I'm not giving you that exclusive on your podcast and finding myself locked away, breaching national security.
Maybe the news hound in me thinks it will give me a story, but it also might put you in prison for 10 years. So maybe that's no bad thing. Should we move on to another topic we're really keen to talk about, and President Trump? Now, Simon, you've got a fairly extensive experience of dealing with the advent of a new Trump presidency, because as Theresa May's PPS, you were there when he was first elected in 2016. That was a big shock. And again, Keir Starmer's cabinet secretary in November last night when he was re-elected for his second term. Lightning striking twice in the same place, you could call it. Just describe to us last November 2024, what was it like in Downing Street that morning when you all woke up on November the 6th and discovered he was president again?
I think back then the difference between the two was, real uncertainty then, that really all you knew about him was the campaigner. You didn't really know how he was going to operate as president. And of course, as is happening now, even once he got into power, it takes you a while to understand. Remember when I was doing that job that you describe, I was also what we call our G7 and G20 Sherpa. So this is one of the jobs where you're the senior official before all of the world leaders get together and sit round the table. You know, their flunkies, if you will, sort of are getting together regularly to work out what should they talk about, having a go at first draft of the communique and all of this. And I remember before that first G7 that Trump turned up, we had no idea how he was going to behave. Like now, he talked rather unenthusiastically about some of these fora. Actually, when he turned up, he behaved really quite sort of normally. I'm sorry, I'm not sure there's any. Describing world leaders getting together isn't quite normal. Sorry, that's I should be careful. That's not normal for most people. But actually,
he didn't start a food fight or throw the tables around.
No, not at all. He engaged in the conversations. He did actually want to find common solutions to the problem. So, I think in that first time, it was really unknown, and probably the fear of the unknown was far worse than the reality.
In 2017?
In 2017.
But in 2024, how was it? Someone must have said, oh, Jesus, we've got this again.
Well, as you know, the British government will do business with whoever the people of another nation choose to elect. So, no, but obviously, as you would expect, there was a lot of work done in government to make sure that, that a new set of ministers were prepared. All of the lessons of the last administration had been learned. Actually, the Prime Minister had actually already struck up a good relationship with President Trump. It was actually, he spoke to him when he was just a candidate or an ex-president in the days after that assassination attempt. Actually, the Prime Minister Keir was on the phone and they had a really warm conversation. Actually, the president sounded amazingly unbothered by the fact that he'd had a near miss.
Let me return the favour, Tom, since you put me on the spot earlier on. So you were covering the campaign. You followed every element of that campaign in the US, and you saw and wrote about the things that he said and did. Do you see continuity between what he campaigned on and the way he's governed? And if not, if so, why were we surprised by some of the things he's done?
Yes, and yes, to answer that. So up front and close and personal, going to pretty much every Trump rally he did, or most of them, from the assassination attempt in Butler onwards, my first ever Trump rally. I thought, my God, are they all like this? He said exactly what he has gone on to do, whether it's tariffs, whether it's trying to get a deal in Ukraine in a day, obviously that hasn't quite happened, whether it's mass deportation. He has tried extremely hard to enact all that. But the great disconnect for me was everyone back here, and even actually quite a lot of the media in the US, the liberal West and East Coast media, was saying, yeah, that's what Trump says. don't look at what he says, look what he actually does, because they're a lot different. He'll never go and do all that stuff. And I was thinking, well, I think he might, because this time he's handpicked his own cabinet. There aren't going to be as they were referred to, the grown-ups in the room who'll persuade him out of it. He's got people picked entirely for loyalty to go and do just what he says he'll do. So I think, for me, UK PLC were a bit slow to pick up on that. And you can possibly tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah, I would agree. Clearly, Trump as the 47th president is different to Trump as the 45th president. He's learned some lessons about how to be effective and get your will done. Prime ministers go through the same, by the way, of learning how to get what
Things
you
done.
want out of the machinery. But there were many things that he said as the 45th president which people got very upset. You know, we had all sorts of, we said him saying many things about NATO back then. We had him talking about trade. We had extraordinary attempt to befriend our dear leader in North Korea. There are plenty of things that he said he was going to do that he's done this time. But I mean, he hasn't yet taken Greenland. He hasn't taken the Panama Canal. Talk about grown-ups in the room, and maybe there's an absence. I will just note that after, at some point in the tariff escalation, and then introducing language about the Fed chair, he then rode back quite a lot. He stopped all the language about removing the Fed chair. And it was widely reported, that grown-ups in the room had said, hold on a minute, let's stop. So I think the thing, and I have to say, I think Keir Starmer and this government is playing a blinder with Trump and certainly doing a lot better than many other nations.
What do you think the trick is?
I think there's a few things to dealing with him interpersonally. I think, one, stand your ground. He is a deal maker. He will test and probe, and it isn't going to respond well if you just sit there and agree with everything he says. So you do need to stand your ground. But in one sense, what you see is what you get. There is a very big ego, even amongst US presidents, and I've seen quite a lot of those. They are all obviously quite large egos. There's a particular ego that you do have to be warm and friendly towards him to make progress. And I'd say Keir's done that. Of course, being a winner helps with Mr. Trump. He likes winners. And of course, one of the first things he knew about Keir Starmer as Prime Minister was he won an absolutely stonking majority. Say what you like about opinion polls now, but the reality is that is what most leaders see in our Prime Minister, is a man with an enormous majority. So that looks very politically stable and he looks like a winner. So Trump responds to that. And of course, we know that President Trump has a deep affection for the UK for sort of personal reasons.
Lucky us.
Lucky us.
When you look at what he said and what he's doing, can you see a grand worldview, or is he just reacting to things?
I think I would probably put it as a man with instincts, actually, as much as anything else. I think, and instincts which are obviously informed by a number of different influences. Clearly, there is, he is attracted to doing business with strong leaders and does think it is his role to resolve conflict.
Yeah, he seems to hold that deeply.
So I think actually, sort of without getting too deeply into the psychology of him, he is actually surprisingly dovish. I think a lot of people would look at him and think he's some sort of crazed warmonger just because that's what they think of the character. Actually, by nature, he really isn't that, and I understand there's...
Although he's not afraid to use force, as he did in his first administration.
No, I mean, he probably did the world a favour by taking out Soleimani, the head of the one of the Iranian malign forces.
Killed a lot of my soldiers.
Yeah, that was a bold move. But what was really interesting, and people laughed at him when he first said it, that he sent his son-in-law Jared Kushner in to fix the Middle East, and actually, without much fanfare in the end, they actually managed to deliver the Abraham Accords, which probably have been really, quite fundamentally important, actually, in the last couple of years, in terms of peace and stability in the Middle East, and certainly for all of its difficulties right now, are quite an important thing. Actually, he did try and do a deal with the North Koreans to bring them down. Recently he talks about bringing peace to Ukraine, peace to the Middle East. He was immediately talking about peace between India and Pakistan in their recent flare-up.
Though peace on the right terms.
Yeah.
Not just peace for the sake of it.
But I think he is a man who does believe, probably as much for economic reasons as anything else, that peace is good for business.
How do we break President Trump's addiction to Vladimir Putin and believing what Vladimir Putin says?
It looks to me like the scales are falling from President Trump's eyes as we speak. There is growing reporting, which, if accurate, tells us that he is becoming clearer and clearer that Putin is in fact trying to avoid peace.
How have we done
Ukraine.
that? How have we reduced those scales?
I think probably it is just the experience. I'm sure there are a lot of very serious professionals in the US operation, defense, national security, intelligence officials showing him and telling him what Putin is actually doing day in, day out. Whether Putin's serious or not. You can see, what is the delegation he's sending to these peace talks? Is he returning your phone calls? When you speak to him, is he actually talking about making those early steps towards peace, or is he just fobbing you off? President Trump is a businessman. He's done many deals in his life. I suspect he's a pretty good judge of whether somebody is playing for time in a negotiation or whether I don't know, maybe that's too optimistic. But I would say for a man who said he could get peace won within a day because of this stupid, pointless war, I would just note we've been on some ups and downs here, and it looks to me like the US administration is...
Yeah, I hope you're right. So we've got NATO summit coming up in The Hague in just over a month's time, probably shaping up to be the most consequential NATO summit since the end of the Cold War. We have Pete Hegseth making clear that the US is stepping back as the guarantor of European security. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, a former NATO Secretary General, said, and I quote, that the security architecture that Europe relied on for generations is gone and not coming back. We are existentially alone and vulnerable. And it didn't go too well the first time around that President Trump came to a NATO summit. Yeah. So how important is this summit, and what would good look like, and what are the risks associated with it?
I suspect it will be the greatest significance will be that messaging, signalling, deterrent sort of thing that comes out of it. So it will be really important that some positives come out of it, probably on a few fronts. One is that quite alarming language for those of us who have for our whole lives sort of believed in NATO and that Western alliance, that actually we will see a very different bunch of statements coming out. I suspect they won't be all smiles and it won't all be that easy. But a shift in tone, I think, will be really quite important, obviously, including, most importantly, from the United States. So some positive language coming out about the importance of NATO. I know that's the sort of thing that can sound a bit airy-fairy, the sort of thing that a former G7, G20 Sherpa would say. Is,
Make it as inconsequential as possible, is what you're saying.
But I mean, if the thing doesn't collapse, given some of that language and what people are expecting, if NATO survives the conference and comes out with some sort of momentum, that's the sort of thing you take as a diplomatic win.
Wait. That would be to suggest there is a possibility that we go into this summit with all the extraordinary unknowns and volatilities. We come out of it at the end of the summit with NATO in a really bad state. Everyone has a massive row, and it does start to collapse. Is that actually a possibility?
Well, I think if the United States, the president and his delegation decided to say, that's that, I'm walking out of the room, we'd all be very worried. I think it's an extremely low likelihood event, but it will be, as they say, a high impact one if it were to happen. To
quote Elon Musk, its chances are not zero.
Yes, because I'm not sure I quite want to be quoting Elon Musk, but anyway.
But it's extraordinary to even paint that picture, quite frankly. And I didn't disagree. I suspect Patrick wouldn't either. But that is an extraordinary thing to contemplate. You're right. But it's where we are.
But what really matters, though, and I think, one of the things that you want to do through your podcast, and I commend you for it, we've got to bring sober analysis to this. Yes, those are the headlines. Yes, there are all sorts of things that people say when microphones are in front of them. There's not an awful lot of column inches being written about at the moment about the really quite sort of relatively soothing things that are being said, or the things that are, they are happening. They do know, but people don't report about them. You asked about, the US being a reliable nuclear power. Well, I happen to know that at the Defence Secretary's meeting, so John Healey with Pete Hegseth, that was only supposed to be scheduled for 45 minutes or something, and they actually went on for hours because they found such...
A bit like this podcast.
Yeah, a bit like this one. No, they went on for hours because they were getting on so well and they found common cause. And of course, nobody bothers to report that in fact, it looks like the relationship between the two defence secretaries on either side of the Atlantic. So I think we've got to be sober about this. I think in terms of the NATO summit, other things that will matter is obviously Ukraine is going to be a really important part of this. Whether it's, doing things through NATO has been difficult, and people have wanted to avoid them for fairly obvious reasons in not wanting to put NATO in direct conflict with Russia. But NATO has been quite an important force in moral and material support for Ukraine through some of its sort of subsets. So, continuing that support for Ukraine, I think, will also be important. It's one of the things that I think gets lost in the Ukraine debate, is lots of people are focusing on the peace and all the negotiations happening. Whether the negotiations do or don't happen, the thing that really matters first and foremost is we continue to support the Ukrainians in the fight and continue to make it painful for Putin not to come to the negotiating table, because that means you can get that sustainable and lasting peace that we need out of Ukraine. And I think that NATO summit will be quite an important moment for bringing this together.
So this brings us to the biggest challenge that we're facing, which is we've got three challenges in Europe. One is we need to continue to rearm or arm Ukraine to keep them in the fight, and so that you can bring Putin to the table. Secondly, we've got to rearm ourselves for all the reasons we were describing, restore our stockpiles and our deterrence. And third, we're going to need to backfill for the US. So is one of the things we want to get out of the NATO summit agreement on a timetable of US pivoting towards Asia that works within European capacity?
That sort of orderly approach and outcome to the US shifting more towards Pacific defence and Europe moving quickly to stand on its own two legs, I think would be a real bonus, would be a real win. Or at least, probably more likely, knowing how these conferences go, these summits go, is the beginnings of a process to work through that timetable together.
Okay, before you leave us, Simon, we did want to ask you a few non-defence questions about your time as Cabinet Secretary, because it really did coincide with quite an extraordinary political period. Do you miss being at the epicentre of things for so long?
Not at all. I really don't. I never believed it when I was in, still in role, in post, and I would meet predecessors or sort of former colleagues who'd come along, and they were always smiling and they looked much healthier. They didn't look quite so pale, and they'd say, it's great. And you think, oh no, surely not. And I've got there, and I really don't. And it's for a number of reasons. I mean, one of them is I have a few roles that I continue to do now, which allow me to continue working on the things that I find most interesting. So there's a project that I'm doing up in Barrow, which is where we build our nuclear submarines. I still do bits and pieces of work for the Ministry of Defence. So that allows me still to stay connected to things that personally matter, but not having to worry about some of the day-to-day. I wouldn't wish to describe everything that you did as a political journalist as trivia, Tom. But,
not everything, but that's kind of you.
But, as you can imagine, you'd come into work first thing in the morning and there'd be a lot of things that would be going on in the media space or in the day-to-day of Parliament, which wouldn't necessarily be most consequential in the grand sweep of history. But that is nevertheless really important in the day-to-day flow of Downing Street. So you focus on those. And so you're not spending your time on the rise of China. Where are we bringing AI into the world? How are we prepared? All of these huge questions that actually, I have found, as an ex-cabinet secretary, I have a lot more time to think about those big issues than I did as cabinet secretary, rather tragically.
Well, as we were saying, it's an extraordinary period. And it must be said, at the height of COVID, and I think you'd concede this, it coincided with the Partygate scandal, the appalling internal power struggle going in the sign-up attempt between Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, his chief of staff, the interscene Tory warfare on Brexit. So all the reporting from the outside by the likes of me, whether it was trivia or not, as you put it, and I don't think you really did mean to put it like that, it did look bad. It did look like quite a mess inside Number 10. And I guess the question is, how representative was that reporting? How bad was it?
To truly answer that question, I think you probably need to call my therapist in the room, because we'll end up triggering PTSD. I mean, what do I really think back on? Huge issues playing out that definitely affected the day-to-day. As you said, sort of after 2016 and our Brexit vote, we had huge. I mean, that unleashed enormous sort of political disagreements. We thought we were having a referendum to actually sort of answer a question we disagreed on. If anything, it just opened up a whole new set of questions for us to disagree, which are playing out this week again with the UK-EU summit, with another version of Brexit being negotiated. So, it was very difficult. I mean, undoubtedly true that there were lots of personalities. There have always been difficult personalities in Downing Street. We have to be very careful that we don't always just think that the latest version of Downing Street is the most extraordinary thing that we've ever seen, and the X or Y person is a big, dark, difficult figure. What I would say, though, is the issues we were dealing with were huge. During my time as Cabinet Secretary, I came in after the first wave of COVID, another year and a half of dealing with the COVID response, invasion of Ukraine, war in the Middle East, unprecedented challenges on our public services. The thing I would say most, the vast majority of people, they're working unbelievably hard, long hours to try and solve these problems. I think we would all have wished at times personality didn't get in the way, but I think that's probably true of most centres of power.
So let's talk about personality. You've got 6 different prime ministers over the course of 14 years. I mean, how on earth do you keep the ship of government stable with that much turbulence and upheaval?
4 and 5 years when you were cabinet secretary.
Yeah, they were a bit like London buses. What matters, I think, this is one of the strengths of our system. There are weaknesses to this, but one of the strengths is the sort of the professional civil service and people like you, Patrick, the armed forces, people who are there to try and keep hold of those long-term issues, those long-term trends, and support politicians as they come and go. There are definitely downsides to that. It can mean, I think, that we're not quick enough sometimes to change. We can, the status quo can sometimes be too prevalent in the conversation. At the heart of being Prime Minister, though, a bit like being President, there's a personality, and it's the job of the machinery around them to bring what needs to be said. You need to give your advice. You need to learn how to give sometimes the difficult messages, sometimes to give the difficult advice. But what you've got to do is learn very quickly how this personality works and what's the best way of landing your messages. And that takes skill. One of my former colleagues described to me the role of sort of working in Downing Street. So the job of being Prime Minister sometimes feels like going up or down a really rickety staircase in an old English country house. And the job of the civil servants or the professionals in uniform there is to be the banister that they can hold on to as they go up and down the rickety staircase. And I quite like that analogy, I have to say.
It's not far from the truth, having been in Downing Street, just like you, quite a lot.
Yeah, I think, Simon, that we must touch upon briefly. Throughout your time, Number 10, you saw some pretty extraordinary things. One thing you had to do, though, in particular, on the 8th of September 2022, it was your job to inform the then Prime Minister, who was Liz Truss, that Queen Elizabeth had died. What on earth did it feel like to do that?
Well, even as you asked me, a lump comes into my throat and the hair stands up on the back of my neck. It was one of the most extraordinary things. And actually, I'd probably, compared to most, I had quite a lot of warning that this was coming, months out, that we were heading towards the end. And then within the last few days that we were really now very close. Yeah, it was extremely difficult to take that call from the palace.
Who rang you?
The Queen's private secretary. Of all things, you have a telephone tree and a diagram that says X will ring Y, and that's what the diagram said.
Where were you, in your office?
No, I was actually. We were in the flat upstairs in Downing Street in the sitting room, because I'd had a couple of hours warning, and we knew this wasn't going to be very easy news. So we actually took ourselves. The Prime Minister, Liz Truss, said, "Well, actually, let's just go out of the office. Let's go somewhere else, because when this news comes in, we'll want to think this through." So there were just a couple of us upstairs, and the news came through from Edward, and it was extremely hard not to sort of to do your Sir Humphrey and not actually to sort of break down emotionally when the news finally came through.
I found myself exactly the same position. I was having lunch, funny enough, with General Jim Mattis, so the former Defence Secretary, and General Graham Lamb, who's a very old friend, and the three of us in Lambo's house in Surrey. And I got about 2 hours' notice before the official announcement was made, and it took, as you can imagine, it sort of took all the wind out of our sails, and we just sat there reflective.
It was pretty extraordinary to think about this life that had defined so much about our lives and our nation, and in fact the world, that was no longer with us. It was quite an extraordinary moment. Perhaps a bit like you, Patrick, though. I mean, one of the odd things, a bit like dealing with enormous crises in government, all these events, pretty quickly there's something you have to get on and do. Yep. There's a statement to be drafted, or phone calls to be made, or okay.
I started polishing my screws.
Yeah, exactly. Right. We'd better tell the right people, because they're going to have to start rehearsing. How are we telling foreign leaders? All that sort of thing. Are the flags coming down to half mast at the right time? And are we all? It was. It was an extraordinary experience.
You have to keep buggering on.
Yeah, and I say it was the first time, because I finished that phone call by saying, "God save the King," which is the first time that I had to say that. And you think, right, well, that's it's just another of those things that's going to change. We've gone from Her Majesty's government to His Majesty's government in a moment.
You were probably the first person in Britain, if not the world, to say that.
Probably was, yeah.
And that is probably a good point where we should wrap up. It's just been an absolutely intriguing conversation, Simon. We could have gone on for another 6 or 7 hours, probably. Thank you so much for talking to us, though. You've given us some absolutely fascinating insights.
One before you go. As you look back on this conversation, and keeping in mind that one of the things we hope to do with this podcast is to reassure and not just scare, are you optimistic about the future? Do we got grounds for optimism?
Yes, because we've recognised the world as it is. That's a really important thing that governments have to do. We've talked about some of the mechanics, how much money you're spending on defence. We've talked about some of the challenges of, NATO alliance. We've talked a little bit about defence industry. We've talked about more nuclear weapons. The thing that I think reassures me more than anything else is we have a government here, actually, and to be apolitical about it, I think the last government, Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister, spotted it. And I would say governments across Europe have spotted the scales truly have fallen from their eyes. It is time that the UK and European defence was put on a much stronger footing. And I think that's a really important thing, because yes, that means we're more secure. We haven't really talked about it, but in the midst of that, if we get it right, there's good jobs and good opportunities for people across the UK. There's a really sort of positive side for this. There's opportunities in technology. Seize the day, seize the moment.
Brilliant. Well, that's a great place to end. Thank you very much, Simon. And that's also the end of episode 1 of the General and Journalist podcast. What a way to start. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week, Tom.
We will. And if you like what you've heard, please do follow us wherever you are listening to us. And until next week, thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Tom.